At exactly 5:12 on a Friday evening, the heat in my house died, and I knew right away it had not failed. It had been taken. I was standing in my kitchen in my socks, holding a mug of coffee that had already gone cold, watching my 9-year-old granddaughter Lily draw snowflakes on a paper plate at the table, while outside, at the end of my driveway, the president of our Lakeside Property Board smiled like she had just won something. Her name was Vivian Cross, and if you've ever lived under one of those small, private neighborhood boards where everybody pretends it is about community standards, but it is really about control, then you already know the type. White wool coat, leather gloves, pearl earrings, the kind of woman who could say bless your heart and make it sound like a parking ticket. Her husband, Grant, stood beside her utility truck with a clipboard in his hand, and he would not look me in the eye. Vivian did all the talking. She said, "Mr. Palmer, you have been notified 3 times about unpaid infrastructure assessments. Your balance is now $11,600. And under Section 8 of the North Hollow Ridge bylaws, your home is being disconnected from the thermal loop until payment is made in full." Then she tilted her head toward my lit kitchen window, toward Lily, toward the room where I had promised my daughter everything would be fine. And she said, "I hope you have blankets." That was the moment I realized she had no idea whose driveway she was standing in. She did not know I had designed the heating loop under that entire ridge 24 years earlier. She did not know the original emergency control panel was still inside my cellar behind an old cedar cabinet my father built with his own hands. And she definitely did not know that by sunrise, every mansion on that ridge would be learning what cold feels like when it stops being a threat and becomes evidence. My name is Owen Palmer. I'm 57 years old, a licensed mechanical engineer, widower, father of 1, grandfather of 1, and for most of my adult life I have lived in the same stone farmhouse outside Ashford, Maine, about 3 miles from the Canadian border and a long way from anybody who thinks winter is decorative. The house was built by my grandfather, repaired by my father, and inherited by me with every drafty window, every stubborn pipe, and every memory still inside the walls. Behind the house, past a stand of birch trees and an old frozen pond where my daughter used to skate, sits the pump house with a North Hollow thermal exchange system, a Berry district heating loop that serves 72 homes along the ridge. I designed it in 2000. Back when the development was still a muddy construction road and rich people from Boston were buying lots because somebody told them the view would appreciate faster than the stock market. The developer needed land for the wells, easements for the underground lines, and a little brick building to house the pumps, the exchanges, and the master controls. My father owned that land. He was not a lawyer, but he had lived long enough to know that a handshake is just a handshake until money gets involved. So he signed a recorded agreement that gave the neighborhood access to the wells in exchange for permanent heat service to our farmhouse. No assessments, no surcharge, no board vote, no future interpretation. Permanent meant permanent. At least it until Vivian Cross decided permanent sounded inconvenient. Vivian had become board president 6 years before that night, and she came in with the kind of confidence people get when nobody has told them no in decades. She called old covenanters outdated. She called recorded easements legacy clutter. She called my farmhouse an architectural inconsistency, which was funny, considering it had been standing on that hill for 112 years before her cedar shingle weekend palace showed up with heated gutters and a wine room. Her husband, Grant, owned Cross Ridge Services, the contractor the board hired to maintain the very system I had designed. That was the beginning of the rot. At first it was small things, missed inspection reports, pump readings that looked copied from the month before, glycol percentages that did not match the weather, and I noticed the backup circulation line had been shut off to save power. Then I found out the freeze protection alarm had been disabled because Grant said homeowners complained about false notifications. Then, 2 older residents had their radiant floors fail during a cold snap and were quietly told it was an interior plumbing issue. I kept records. I took photos. I downloaded reports. I saved emails. I did what engineers do when people with nicer coats start lying about systems they do not understand. I documented. But I did not act, not at first, because there is a difference between being right and being ready. And my mother used to say the world is full of men who confuse the two. My mother, Nora Palmer, was a hospice nurse for 34 years, and she could sit beside a dying man, hold his hand, and still make the billing department afraid of her by lunch. She had a voice she used when kindness was done asking permission. Low, steady, almost gentle, but with a door closing somewhere inside it. I had not used that voice in years. My daughter Claire used to joke that when Grandma Nora dropped her voice, even the furnace listened. Claire was 32 that winter, living 40 minutes south in a women's recovery residence after losing 3 years to pills, badmen, and the kind of grief neither of us had known how to talk about after my wife died. Lily had been with me for 14 months. She was small for her age, sharp as a tack, and carried a stuffed fox named Captain Beans everywhere like he was part toy, part legal counsel. That Friday she had a mild fever, and the radio had been warning all afternoon about a polar storm coming in from Quebec. 2 feet of snow, white-out wind, temperatures dropping below zero before morning. So when Vivian shut off my heat, she was not punishing an account number. She was gambling with a child. 2 days earlier, she had come to my porch with a cream-colored envelope and that polished smile of hers. "Owen," she said, "the board has reviewed your property file and determined your exemption is no longer compatible with the revised infrastructure policy." I told her my exemption was not a policy. It was a recorded land agreement. She said the board's attorney believed the agreement was unenforceable against the current association. I told her the board's attorney could believe in mermaids if he wanted. It would not change the registry office. Her smile tightened. Then she said something I will never forget. "People like you always hide behind old paper because you cannot afford the present." I looked past her at Grant, who was staring at the porch boards, and I understood something important. This was not about money. Not really. It was about land. It was about embarrassment. It was about Vivian wanting every odd-old piece of North Hollow Ridge polished, renamed, billed, and brought onto her thumb. And my farmhouse sat there like a missing tooth in her perfect smile. After she left, Lily came out wearing her purple hoodie and asked if the fancy lady was mad at us. I said, "No, sweetheart. She's mad at a piece of paper." Lily thought about that and said, "Can paper win?" I told her, "Good paper can." Then Friday came, and Grant turned the valve at 5:12, and the house began to cool so quietly it felt personal. By 8, the kitchen was 61 degrees. By 10, Lily was asleep on the couch under 3 quilts, Captain Beans tucked under her chin, breathing through her mouth because of the fever. I got the old wood stove going, badly at first, with smoke backing into the room and my eyes watering so hard I had to laugh because the alternative was putting my fist through a wall. Around midnight, headlights slid across the window. Vivian's SUV stopped at the end of my drive. She rolled down her window and took pictures of the smoke from my chimney. Probably for some nuisance violation she had been saving in her little velvet bag of punishments. I stood in the dark kitchen and raised my coffee mug to her like a toast. She drove away. At 2018 in the morning, Lily started coughing. That dry little cough children make when a room is too cold and adults have failed them. I sat beside her until dawn with one hand on her blanket and the other on my phone, looking at the storm warning, the temperature, the old agreement, and a scanned copy of Section 13, the emergency operator clause my father had insisted on in 1999. At 6:35 a.m., I called my attorney, Denise Calder. At 6:20, I called an old friend from engineering school named Paul Soren, who had spent 30 years designing municipal heat systems in Minnesota. He answered on the second ring and said, "Owen, why do I hear murder in your breathing?" I said, "Not murder, Paul. Thermodynamics." He was quiet for maybe 2 seconds. Then he said, "I will bring my tools." Paul Soren got to my house a little after 10 that morning in a rust-colored pickup that looked like it had survived 3 divorces and at least 1 tornado. And riding beside him was his niece Maren, 31 years old, quiet, sharp-eyed, and, as Paul proudly announced before she even got her boots off, a licensed mechanical engineer who understood district heating better than most men twice her age and had the unfortunate family habit of enjoying lawsuits. Lily was already gone by then. Denise, my attorney, had told me in that very calm lawyer voice of hers to get the child out of the house before we did anything else. Because if Vivian wanted to play by paper, and we were going to give her paper until she choked on it. So at 8 that morning, I packed Lily's medicine, Captain Beans, 2 sweaters, her tablet, and the little pink toothbrush she refused to replace. And I drove her through sideways snow to the Pine Lantern Inn in Ashford Village. The owner, Hal Mercer, had known my father and still called me young Owen, even though my knees made noise every time I stood up. He opened room 6 himself, turned the heat up to 74, and told Lily the hot chocolate machine in the lobby was under her supervision. She looked at me from the edge of the bed. Cheeks flushed, Fox tucked under one arm, and asked, "Grandpa, are you going to make the house warm again?" I said yes. She said, "Are you going to yell at the fancy lady?" I said, "No, sweetheart. I am going to be worse than yelling. I am going to be correct." She nodded like that made perfect sense. Then she said, "Use Grandma Nora's voice." That hit me harder than I expected. Kids notice more than we think, and they inherit things we never meant to pass down. I kissed the top of her head, told Hal not to let her negotiate extra marshmallows without legal representation, and drove back into the storm with my hands shaking on the wheel. When I got home, Paul and Maren were already unloading equipment into my kitchen. Laptops, binders, pressure gauges, portable heaters, battery lights, and one battered metal thermos Paul claimed contained coffee, but smelled like it had opinions. The house was 53 degrees. Frost had started feathering the inside corners of the windows. Maren walked in, looked around once, and said, "They disconnected a residence with a minor child inside during an active winter storm warning." It was not a question. I said yes. She looked toward the ridge, where the expensive houses disappeared into snow and birch trees, and said, "That is the stupidest rich person decision I have heard this month." Paul grunted and said, "Month is young." For the next 3 hours, we worked at my kitchen table like 3 people preparing for surgery. Denise was on speakerphone from Portland, filing emergency motions and swearing under her breath in a way that made me glad Lily was not there. We reviewed the 1999 agreement, the operator clause, the easement maps, the system schematics, the maintenance reports Grant had filed, and the photos I had taken of disabled alarms and closed backup lines. Maren found the first clean contradiction in less than 20 minutes. The January inspection report said the freeze response system had been tested under load. My photo from the same week showed the test valve zip tied shut and painted over. Paul leaned back, took off his glasses and said, "I have seen lazy, I have seen cheap, and I have seen criminal. This is all 3 wearing a fleece vest." I did not laugh, but I wanted to. At noon, Denise called the State Energy Safety Office. By 12:30, we had a deputy commissioner named Aaron Pike on the line, and I gave him the whole story in the flattest voice I had, because I knew if I let anger into it, Vivian would somehow become the victim in somebody's report. I told him about the heat cut. I told him about Lily's fever. I told him about the storm, the disabled protections, the false inspection logs, the recorded agreement, and the emergency operator clause. There was a long silence. Then Aaron said, "Mr. Bill Palmer, are you telling me a private board allowed its contractor, who is married to the board president, to interrupt thermal service during a severe weather event, while that same contractor may have falsified safety compliance records?" I said yes. He said, "I'm going to need you to preserve every record you have and avoid any unnecessary damage." Denise cut in before I could answer and said, "Commissioner, my client is a licensed engineer of record with contractual emergency authority and a duty to protect public safety. The system is already unsafe. He is preparing to expose and stabilize that unsafe condition and a controlled evacuation." Another silence. Then Aaron said, "Make sure every household receives notice. Make sure no person is left in danger. Make sure you record everything. Off the record, I would not want to be Mrs. Cross right now." At 1:15, Vivian called. I let it ring twice, then put her on speaker while Denise, Paul, and Maren listened. Her voice had changed. Yesterday, she had sounded like a woman collecting a fee. Now she sounded like someone who had just discovered fees can collect by. "Owen," she said, "I believe this has gotten out of hand. Grant is prepared to restore your service as a courtesy while we continue reviewing the account." I looked at the frost on my kitchen window and thought of Lily coughing at 2 in the morning. Then I found my mother's voice, low, calm, almost kind. "Vivian, you are not restoring anything. As of sunset, I'm assuming emergency control of the North Hollow thermal system under the recorded operator clause. The board no longer has operational authority." She laughed once, not because anything was funny, but because people like Vivian laugh when reality arrives in work boots. "You do not have the authority to touch community infrastructure." I said, "Vivian, I am the engineer of record. It is on my land. The agreement is recorded. Your husband has been falsifying maintenance reports. Your board cut heat to a sick child during a polar storm. So I need you to listen carefully. At 6:30 tonight, every occupied home on that loop needs to have alternate heat or be empty. At 7, the system goes into emergency demonstration mode for state review." She stopped laughing. "You little hillbilly fossil," she said softly. "You think old paper makes you powerful. No, I said. I think old paper makes you careless. Then I hung up. Paul stared at me for a second and said, Nora would have bought you a pie for that. At 2, we went down to the cellar. I had not opened the cedar cabinet in years. It sat behind shelves of paint cans, old storm windows, and a cardboard box labeled Clare School stuff that I still had not been brave enough to sort. The cabinet door stuck at first, swollen from age and damp, and when it finally came loose, the smell of cedar and dust came out like a memory. Inside was the emergency control board, grey steel, brass wheels, pressure dials, old labels in my father's handwriting, and one red-covered switch that seemed too bright for the dark. Taped above it was a note in a plastic sleeve. I knew it was there. I had forgotten I knew. Owen, if this cabinet is open, somebody forgot what the system is for. Keep people warm. Do not let fools freeze the truth out of a room. That, 1999 timed. I read it once. Then again, Paul looked away like he was giving me privacy in my own basement. Marin, who had been all business since she arrived, wiped one eye with her sleeve and pretended she had dust in it. For a minute, I was not 57. I was 29 again, standing beside my father while we commissioned that system, both of us younger than we understood, believing good design could outlive bad management. Then the phone upstairs started ringing again, and the minute was over. By 3:15, Marin had rebuilt the emergency notification list from old system records and current county property data. We sent the first alert at 3:28. Emergency thermal loop intervention scheduled for 7 p.m. due to documented safety failure. All residents must evacuate or secure alternate heat by 6:30 p.m. Warning shelter open at Ashford High School gym and White Pine Lodge lobby. No resident should remain in a home without independent heat. Questions should go to council. That last line was Denise's idea, and I loved her for it. The calls began immediately. Some people were scared. Some were angry. Some had already heard rumors and wanted to know if Vivian was being arrested, which told me the community grapevine was working faster than the state. Marin answered most of them, steady and patient, explaining that the goal was safety first, evidence second, repairs third. Paul coordinated with Hal at the inn, the high school custodian, and a retired snowplow driver named Ben Rusk, who had once pulled my truck out of a ditch and never let me forget it. Ben agreed to pick up elderly residents who could not drive. By 5:30, 58 households had confirmed they were out. 9 had gone to relatives. 4 had backup propane heat and sent photos of safe operation. That left 1 elderly couple, 2 empty vacation homes, several unanswered numbers, and, of course, Vivian and Grant. At 6:10, the sheriff's department called to say the elderly couple had been picked up by Ben, who apparently arrived wearing a reflective vest and calling himself Director of Evacuation Snacks. At 6:20, every occupied home was accounted for except the Cross residence. At 6:38, headlights came up my driveway. Vivian and Grant stepped out into the storm, both of them bent against the wind, suddenly looking smaller than they had from my kitchen window the night before. I opened the door before they knocked. Vivian's face was red from cold and fury. Grant looked like a man who had finally read the manual after breaking the machine. Vivian said, "Owen, enough. You have made your point." I said, "Not yet." Grant spoke for the first time in 2 days. "Owen, if you do this, pipes are going to fail." I looked at him. "Grant, pipes have already been waiting to fail. You just kept charging people not to notice." Vivian pointed one gloved finger at me. "You will be sued into the ground." "Maybe," I said, "but the ground is mine too. You have 12 minutes to get to the lodge. At 7 o'clock, I am pulling the mask off your system." Vivian's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time since I had known her, she had no polished sentence ready. Grant touched her elbow. She yanked away, but she walked back to the SUV. They drove down the hill, into the white dark, and I closed the door. At exactly 7, Hall handed me the signed engineering declaration. Marin started the recording. Denise stayed on speaker, silent now, because even lawyers know when a moment belongs to someone else. I put my hand on the red switch, and for 1 second I saw my father's handwriting, my mother's steady face, Claire before the drugs, Lily asleep in a warm motel room with a stuffed fox under her chin. I did not feel powerful. I felt tired. I felt sad. I felt very, very awake. Then I lifted the cover and switched the system into emergency mode. For the first few seconds after I flipped that switch, nothing dramatic happened. And I think that is the part people never understand about real consequences. They expect thunder, sparks, sirens, some movie moment where the villain looks up and knows the world has changed. But the cellar just hummed in a lower key. The old gauges trembled. The pump relay clicked twice. And somewhere under the frozen ground, the warm fluid that had kept 72 expensive houses comfortable for 2 decades began moving in the wrong direction on purpose. Paul watched the pressure readings on his laptop. Maren stood beside the panel with her phone recording every dial, every timestamp, every movement of my hands. Denise stayed silent on speaker. I could hear the storm pushing against the cellar windows. And above us, in the kitchen, the old farmhouse creaked like it was clearing its throat. At 7:12, the loop temperature began to fall. At 7:40, the first homeowner text came in from the high school gym, saying her smart thermostat had dropped from 71 to 66. At 8:15, the average indoor reading across the ridge was 59. Nobody was cheering. Nobody snapped a table. Paul poured coffee into a chipped mug and said, "Well, there it is. That was all, there it is. The truth, finally measurable." By 9, the lodge lobby was packed with people in ski jackets and slippers, holding dogs, pill bottles, phone chargers, and little bags of whatever they had grabbed when they realized the warning was not a bluff. Some of them were furious at me. I understood that. It is hard to love the man holding the mirror when the mirror is freezing your breakfast nook. But anger is not always wrong. It just does not always know where to land first. Maren took calls for hours, and I heard her say the same thing again and again. "Mr. Palmer did not disable your protections. Cross Ridge Services did. Mr. Palmer did not hide the reports. Your contractor did. Mr. This." Palmer gave evacuation notice because the system was already unsafe. At 9:30, the sheriff called from the White Pine Lodge and said Vivian had arrived but was standing in the lobby telling residents I had committed domestic terrorism against radiant flooring. I almost smiled at that, because if Vivian Cross had one gift, it was making herself sound persecuted by plumbing. At 10:20, Grant called my landline. His voice was rough, not angry anymore, just scared. "Owen," he said, "the East Branch is going to lock up if you keep it down too long." I said, "I know." He said, "Those homes will split limes." I said, "I know that too." Then he whispered, "Vivian told me to cut yours." I let that sit there between us. Finally, I said, "Grant, Vivian did not falsify 5 years of safety reports with your signature on them." He did not answer. That silence was the first honest thing I had heard from him in years. Around midnight, the first pipe burst notification came in from a security camera in a vacation home on Laurel Spur. A bright silver line in a utility room split along the seam, and water sprayed sideways in a glittering fan until the pressure fell. By 1:15, they were 9. By 2:26, by 3:30, the count was over 50. And the ridge was no longer a neighborhood. It was a ledger. Every shut valve, every skipped inspection, every fake maintenance report, every board meeting where Vivian smiled and said the system was healthy. All of it was writing itself into drywall and copper. I sat at my kitchen table with my coat on and my mother's old wool blanket around my shoulders, and I did not feel victorious. I felt like a man watching a bridge collapse after warning people for years about the cracks. At 2:43, Vivian called. I almost did not answer, but Denise said, "Take it," on speaker. So I did. Vivian was crying, and not the elegant kind of crying some people do when they still want to control the room. This was ugly, frightened, human crying. "Owen, please," she said. "Our house is flooding." I said, "Are you and Grant safe?" She said, "We are at the lounge." I said, "Then stay there." She said, "Turn it back on." I said, "No, not until state inspectors arrive and certify the safety system." She snapped then, even through tears, "You wanted this. You wanted to humiliate me." I looked at Paul. I looked at Maren. I looked toward the cellar door and my father's note behind it. "No, Vivian," I said. "I wanted you to stop before a child coughed in a 50-degree room. You made humiliation the only language your board still understood." She made a sound like she had been slapped. Then the line went dead. By dawn, the storm had weakened. The sky over the birches turned pale gray, then almost blue, that hard northern color that makes everything look clean even when it is ruined. At 6:28, Maren read the final tally from her laptop. 72 homes, 72 confirmed failures. Paul removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. I stood up, walked to the back door, and opened it. Cold air rolled in, but for the first time in 2 days, it did not scare me. It just was. At 8, The state vehicles came up the road behind 2 plows, Energy Safety State Police, 2 investigators from the Attorney General's office, and 1 federal agent in a black coat who looked too young to have that little patience. They photographed the control panel, the agreement, my father's note, the logs, the emergency alerts, grants reports, my photos, the zip-tied valves, the painted-over test points, the whole ugly anatomy of negligence. By noon, Cross Ridge Services was locked down. By evening, Vivian had resigned from the board in a letter that used the word misunderstanding 4 times and responsibility 0 times. 3 months later, Grant pleaded guilty to contractor fraud and falsifying safety compliance documents. Vivian fought longer. Of course she did. But eventually, she took a deal too. Wire fraud, reckless endangerment, misuse of association funds. The restitution number was just over $2 million. The board was dissolved, then rebuilt as a resident cooperative with plain English rules and one beautiful sentence on the first page. No private association may interrupt heat, water, access, or emergency utilities during a declared weather event. Lily came home that Saturday night. The farmhouse was warm by then, because the old stove had held, and because Paul and Marin stayed long enough to help me bring my side of the loop back safely. She walked in wearing Hal Mercer's oversized sweatshirt, Captain Beans tucked under her arm, and she hugged me so hard my back popped. "Grandpa," she said, "did the paper win?" I looked at the frost melting on the window and thought about my father, my mother, Claire in recovery trying to become Lily's mother again, Vivian in the lodge with every neighbor finally looking at her without fear. I said, "The truth won, sweetheart." But the paper helped. 6 months later, Claire was working mornings at the Ashford Library and taking Lily on Saturday afternoons. The Ridge houses were repaired. Some neighbors thanked me. Some never spoke to me again. That is fair. People like justice better when it does not burst their pipes. But the system is safe now, owned by the people who depend on it, inspected by people who know what they are looking at. And no board president will ever again stand in my driveway during a winter storm and tell a sick child to find blankets. I still have the red switch in my cellar. I hope I never touch it again, but sometimes I go down there, read my father's note, and remember that warmth is not just a temperature. It is a promise, it is a duty. It is what decent people protect before pride, before money, before power. So tell me honestly, if you were one of those homeowners, would you call me a hero? Or would you call me the man who destroyed your house to prove a point? Was I right? Was I wrong? Or was this one of those ugly situations where justice had to come with a repair bill? Drop your answer in the comments, because I really do read them. And if your neighborhood has its own Vivian Cross, its own fake fee, its own little kingdom hiding behind bylaws, tell me that story too. Share this with someone who thinks paper does not matter, and subscribe if you want the next story, because out here, the truth does not always arrive warm, but when it comes all the same.